Until the new folks moved in at 523, our neighborhood was always a quiet and calm place to live. I'd lived there since birth. Between then and my 23rd year, I don't ever recall seeing a cop car on our streets. I was even looking forward to buying my own place around there when I finally settled down. Our new neighbors would do everything they could to undo that calm, almost as soon as they moved in. The word was out the second the new people arrived with the U-Haul. As we all peered curiously from our windows, there was no outward indication these newcomers would be a long-standing problem. Although loud, none of us got very annoyed about their housewarming party later that week. The presence of motorcycles and the bikers that rode them were unsettling to a few, but this was a blue-collar neighborhood. More than a few of us owned a bike or two. The majority of us figured it would be a one-off occasion. There wasn't any reason to get riled up about nothing. Those of us who introduced ourselves came face to face with a friendly young couple. We welcomed them and went on with our lives. The next week, another raucous and unruly gathering occurred. Despite the many complaining posts on our neighborhood's Facebook page, everyone held their tongues. When things finally began to wind down in the early hours of the morning, I let out a breath of relief and slept soundly way into the afternoon. More posts were written, and it quickly became clear no one had the spine to confront them. Things were quiet for the next 2 weeks, and we all were beginning to relax, until the biggest party yet was thrown that Saturday night. By dusk, the streets were so clogged with cars and motorcycles none of the residents could park in front of their houses. That event was more spectacle than simple party. I watched from my bedroom window as hordes of people came and went through the night. It was truly a thing to behold. I like it to one of those high school blowouts they always have in the 80s teen comedies. And it was around 2 a.m. and the party was still in full swing when I saw the police cars pull up. I guess someone had finally had enough. Things were broken up after that. A few of the partygoers were even taken away in handcuffs. The mess we all encountered that morning was unbelievable. I don't think a single person in our street got away unscathed. Beer bottles, broken and whole, littered our lawns. Trash in all forms filled the roads. One resident even had his car sideswiped. Probably the one to suffer the most was Barry. He had the unenviable position of living next door to this headache. In addition to massive amounts of trash, his trees had several broken limbs and his mailbox had been knocked over more than once. I felt terrible for the guy. He was a single father trying to raise a pair of young daughters. He worked 2 jobs and still only barely made ends meet. He was a kind man. The last thing he needed was this mess. We couldn't do anything other than clean up and hope the festivities had finally come to an end. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be. The newcomers did lie low all through Christmas. While it was a good sign, we knew the true test would come on New Year's Eve. Sadly, they would fail. When the choppers and cars began arriving early that evening, everyone feared the worst. If the previous shindig had only been an ordinary Saturday night thing, seeing in the new year would be the destruction of our neighborhood. While I'm happy to say things weren't quite as littered and smashed as they had been before, something far more terrible would result from this party. Noise from 523 would fill the air for most of the night. However, to our delight, once the new year had arrived, the revelers slowly began moving on. When I turned in, only 3 or 4 cars remained outside. I felt much better about what my family and neighbors may have to face with the coming dawn. Although there was still a substantial amount of debris littering the yards, most saw no indication of any damage. I'm sad to tell you, none but the Honorable Barry suffered this fate. I wish I could say that was the worst of what he discovered that cold morning. Before I get ahead of myself, I must tell you the incident as it appeared from my point of view. I had awakened just before 9 a.m. My parents went on a shopping excursion, so I had the house to myself. Over a cup of coffee, I browsed the internet for any interesting news, and I happened to be browsing Reddit when a series of loud pops came from outside. I assumed that these were backfires from an engine, but when the screaming began, I listened closer. To get a better view, I ran upstairs to my room. I didn't see anything at first. The screams had stopped. Maybe some kids were making noise as usual. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a woman hobbling out of 523. It looked to be the wife of the couple. I squinted. thinking I saw blood on the front of her shirt. I ran to my closet and pulled out my binoculars. By the time I made it back to my window, the lady was laying on the lawn, face down. The blood was even more clear on the back of her shirt. She tried lifting herself, but must have lacked the strength. I see Barry calmly walk out of the front door of 523, and I was beginning to breathe heavier now. My heart was pounding like a hammer in my chest. I was transfixed as Barry approached the woman and raised his gun. I knew what was about to happen and wanted to stop it, and I watched as Barry calmly pumped 3 more bullets into the back of his victim. He stood over her and robotically stared. Perhaps he was watching for signs of life, as none came. The odd staring continued for another moment or two before he raised his weapon and fired into his own head. I gasped uncontrollably. I had not expected that. When Barry's body hit the ground, it was like a spell had been broken. I dropped the binoculars and immediately dialed 911 as fast as possible. I watched as the first responders arrived. It was clear there was nothing for them to do. Police were soon crawling all over the place. Even though the urge to stay anonymous was strong, I knew I'd hate myself had I not spoken to them. Reluctantly, I walked across the street and asked to speak to the head investigator. My description sounded almost fantastical to me as I recounted it to him. I returned home, still unsure if I felt any better for what I'd done. I still have dreams, and I'm unable to watch violent movies. Perhaps the point is to do the right thing rather than do it just because it makes you feel good. Don't ask me. Just because I happen to witness the tragedy, I'm certainly not suffering the most from its aftermath. Barry's daughters' lives will never be the same. The youngest of the two may forget her father in time, but the oldest one, who was 7, will always be left with the hole her loving father once filled. While I'm on the subject of Barry's children, I should probably tell you what finally set Barry off. Early in the investigation, authorities released excerpts of a letter Barry left behind. I've already shared a little of what he went through living next to 523. Barry laid out some of the frustrations he was feeling in that letter. He'd been working as much as physically possible to make sure his daughters had a decent Christmas. The oldest had been asking for a new bike for years, but Barry just couldn't afford one. That year, a friend working in a local charity group made sure he received one of their donated bicycles. On Christmas morning, he unveiled it to his daughter, and she was the happiest he'd ever seen her. The hug she gave him that morning made all his sadness and despair go away. Even with snow on the ground, the oldest daughter spent all her waking hours on that bike. He stated that this was the happiest time in his life. Things had been very hard since his wife had abandoned them. Seeing the joy in her face made it all disappear. Unknown to the rest of us, Barry had confronted his neighbors several times about their parties. Every time they would smile to his face and say sorry, only to do the same thing. His property was always the most damaged, and it was clear from the letter he was reaching a breaking point. The final straw was the discovery he had made that New Year's Day. He was outside assessing the destruction left behind. Things appeared to be good, but as he reached the end of his driveway, he noticed deep car tracks across his yard. At the end of those tracks laid his daughter's brand new bicycle, mangled beyond all repair. Darren, the retired man who lived across from Barry, described his reaction to the wrecked bicycle as soul-destroying. He elaborated by saying Barry collapsed onto his knees and wept mournfully. He said it was so heart-wrenching to see. I found myself crying with him, all because of a wrecked bicycle. But to Barry, it represented far more, I remember Darren saying. Suddenly, like a switch had been flipped, he stood up and wiped his face. He went back inside and returned a minute later with his gun. And you all know what occurred after that. The daughters would be shipped off to live with their aunt. I have no idea where they are now and how they're doing, but I'm sure, at least for the oldest, life has to be hard. In the years since the murders, the house has had 2 owners. I believe the second family are currently renting it out. Tenants don't tend to stay long once they find out what happened. One kid who lived there even tried to convince me the house was haunted. The neighborhood itself has returned to its previous state as quiet and calm, and despite this, an underlying feeling of gloom remains. I don't believe this stems from the murders themselves. There's honestly not a single resident around at that time who shed a tear for those neighbors at the time. More for Barry, obviously, and their family. More than likely, we all harbor some amount of guilt. A good man was driven to a despicable act and lost his life in the process. Perhaps if the rest of us had done more, maybe expressed ourselves better, the people living there would have understood how serious the problem truly was. Maybe it's because two wonderful young girls were made orphans. It could all be those and none at the same time. Reasons tend to be no more than excuses. Heck, this could all be in my head. I do know one thing for sure. If some other family or person happens to move into this area and become a thorn in the side of the community, I will go to them personally and relate this story to them. I never again want to wonder if I could have prevented a tragedy. On the off chance you move into a community and think you can run roughshod over your neighbors and be an all-around terror, remember this tale and remember it well. People in America take their peace and quiet seriously. They work hard to have a nice, clean, and quiet place to come home to, and they're willing to go to any length to maintain that peace. It's a fact you may do well not to forget. The hood I grew up in was pretty rough. I was a pretty scrawny white boy, and believe it or not, living in the area that I did, that made things even harder. Just after my 15th birthday, I started bulking up, and the other kids began to look at me differently. I let the fear they now felt toward me go to my head. Fighting, once a terror for me, became my way to express my newfound power over others. If I was even suspicious that a dude was scared of me, I pushed him to the point of breaking. When he threw the first punch, I quickly smashed him. Looking back on that time, I was a terrible person. The following is the story of what made me change. I know now, although every second was terrifying for me, it was exactly what I needed. This happened when I was 19. Me and a few of my friends were invited to a party after one of the high school football games. I think it was homecoming. There were a lot of parties going on that weekend. Some of our friends had rented a hotel room earlier in the night. Instead of going to the dance, they stayed in the room and got absolutely blasted. Me and the two other guys I was riding with hung out there until about 11:30, and that's when we made our way over to a bigger party. It was at my girl's cousin's house. She had this big place on the edge of town. I don't remember where her folks were that night. When we got there, the place was so full the party was spilling out into the front yard. Some dude was on the front porch charging $5 for solo cups and all you could drink for a keg. We had gotten our beer and were sitting on a friend's tailgate, and this is when it all started going downhill. This tall dude I didn't recognize walked by and bumped into my friend. He spilled his beer all over his jacket. We jumped up and pushed the dude to the ground immediately. He fell, and I could see by his face he was scared. And that was when I went on the attack. I called him all sorts of things that I really shouldn't repeat here. And I figured that he would get mad, but instead he said he was going to get some of his friends and come back. I burst out laughing. There was nothing about him that I took seriously for even a second. I've been around some rough dudes, and this guy was not one of them. I just thought it was so funny that I just didn't even want to fight him anymore. We turned back to our beers and soon forgot about the altercation. I'd guessed about an hour passed. I was starting to get a good buzz. I was talking to a group of dudes when all of a sudden I got sucker punched from behind. I managed to stay on my feet, but I was for sure surprised. I was also completely out of my mind at that point, angry. I turned around already in the process of making fists, but before I could, I got sucker punched again from another side. I fell to my knees this time. At this point, I was filled with rage. I was ready to kill anyone that got in my way, and I was about to stand when I felt a hard piece of metal push against my forehead. I think instinctively I knew what it was. My eyes came to focus on a dark pistol. I followed the arm holding it all the way up to a snarling, angry face, and it was the dude that I tried to punk out earlier. At his side stood what I assume was part of his crew, some of the toughest guys I'd ever seen, and there wasn't a shred of fear in their faces, and I could tell I didn't want to say anything stupid. The party all around me had gone silent. I was completely under my assailant's control, and he knew it. For a long minute, he said nothing. Then he let out a faint chuckle and started calling me the things that I called him earlier. I was unsure if I was about to die, but I knew my days of pushing around the weak were completely over. No one would fear me now, especially seeing this. Once a bully is shown for the coward he is, he loses all of his power, and I certainly just had. I was unable to focus on anything but that gun. When I failed to answer his question, he'd slowly pulled back the hammer with his thumb, and I panicked and yelled out that I am what he called me, at the top of my lungs. And this reaction made my victims and his friends burst out laughing. I felt even more powerless now. My mind returned to the days when I was weak and a defenseless little child. I was instantly consumed with the shame at what I'd become. He nonchalantly disengaged the hammer and lowered the gun. The group turned around and walked away, still laughing out loud. I was so relieved I just collapsed to the ground. The people around me were still totally silent. I was completely afraid to move. I kept staring at the ground until the sound of scuffling feet faded away. And when I finally got the courage to look up, I was completely alone. Honestly, I was relieved. I couldn't have faced anyone. I stood up and skulked away into the shadows, too embarrassed to ask for a ride, and I walked the whole 5 miles back to my home. The next morning marked the start of a new life in my eyes. Not a single one of my friends called to check on me, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I laid low for another 9 months before moving to a new city. It wasn't just that I'd been exposed for the coward I'd always been. I was ashamed of that boy. I never wanted to be reminded of him again. I got what came to me, and I tried forgetting my past for another 7 years until an unplanned encounter with a childhood friend. Like me, he had found himself going down the wrong path and had got off just in time. He and I created a non-profit that works with at-risk kids, and that's where I'm at today. There isn't a week that passes that I don't see myself in one of those scared little boys. Some have criminal histories, and although I never strayed too far and never really got caught, I'm able to see where I was headed. If anyone reading this is on the same road, it's not too late to turn things around. If you need help, all you have to do is ask and look. I never want another boy to find himself on his knees again, helpless at the end of a barrel of a gun, begging for just another day or for another chance to make things right. There was a time after college where I was lost. I had no real direction or hopes for the future. Like most, I surrounded myself with an equally aimless group of people. We slept our days away and spent our nights drinking ourselves into a stupor. My greatest ally in this time of debauchery was Stacy. We met our freshman year. We were put together in the dorms. Fortunately, we got along well, so when I moved out to my own place, she came along. It wasn't long before Stacy got a well-earned reputation for holding her liquor better than most guys. Weekend after weekend, the most macho of men bellied up to the table only to be put under it. I secretly admired her for this, but at the same time, feared it may lead down a very bad road. When graduation arrived, we both somehow had degrees, but no prospects or jobs lined up. A year passed and neither of us were working in our chosen fields. While we slogged through the week working dead-end jobs, the weekend was still ours. In a lot of ways, not much had changed. Stacy was still drinking young men under the table and I was just trying to get by. As the months passed, I grew more and more unhappy. Drinking became a bigger part of my life. I became too focused on my own feelings to notice Stacy was actually destroying herself from the inside. In the years prior, she derived great pleasure from knocking these cocky guys down a peg or two. Since we graduated and the realities of life came flooding in, drinking became the only thing she enjoyed. A friend from work was having a birthday party one weekend. On this night, All the years of abuse Stacy had put her body through came back to haunt her. Around an hour after we arrived, she found a new opponent. They swapped drink for another few hours before Stacy began looking sick. I'd never seen her like this before. Wasn't that she was just intoxicated. Her face took on this yellow pallor and she was sweating profusely. I asked if she was okay and was scolded for my effort. Another 30 minutes passed and out of nowhere, she collapsed. Everyone was shocked to see her fall, but I knew she was far from drunk. I kept trying to wake her up, but got no replies. I was getting very scared, and I convinced one of the guys to carry her to my car and I drove her to the hospital. They wheeled her in and went to work, and while I waited in the lobby, all sorts of ideas ran through my head, all but the most obvious, the one I most feared. The hours passed. Around 1 a.m., my worst fears were realized. Stacy actually needed a new liver. Her years of endless drinking had destroyed hers. The doctor said she was only the second person he'd ever seen in their 20s to have such bad cirrhosis. When I finally got to see her, she acted as if though everything was fine. I spent almost an hour trying to convince her of the seriousness of her condition, but she blew me off, and within the next 2 years, she'd be dead. Once she was released, she returned to her regular life. I did all I could to get through to her, but it was ultimately a waste of time. Seeing how our lifestyle was killing her, I had been convinced to change. I began working out and eating better, lost 30 pounds and felt amazing because of it. I couldn't watch Stacy take her own life anymore, this slow death, so I moved out. Our friendship drifted apart, and other than speaking on the phone a few times, we lost contact. As I looked upon her, motionless and stiff in her casket, I regretted our parting. While at the same time I knew my choice to change had been the right one I don't regret a single bit. I do wish I could have convinced her to join me. Since those days, my life has improved greatly. The better things went, the more motivated I became to alter other aspects of my life. Now that I wasn't spending my days recuperating from drinking binges, I had the time and energy to volunteer. I began helping out with special needs students at our local high school. The principal must have liked my work, as she encouraged me to go back and get my credentials, and then join their staff full-time. Since then, I've been a teacher for almost 5 years, and I love every day of it. I'm reminded of a time not long ago when I had a student ask me about my life prior to teaching. I was reluctant to tell her how aimless I'd been then. However, I did want her to know the importance of a healthy routine. I told her, when we're young, it seems like we have nothing but time to kill. Something I discovered was the more free time I was left with, the more trouble I found myself in. That may not be the answer you wanted, but it's a great thing to remember. Now that I've said it, let's hope I can continue following my own advice. Blake and I had been friends at least 15 years. Although I don't recall much from my childhood, I can still see his crying face the day we met. It was our first day of kindergarten, and Blake was bawling his eyes out. He wasn't the only one, but he made an impact. A lot of kids that morning panicked at the idea of separating from their parents. I'm not sure why I didn't, but soon enough, we'd all get used to it. Blake and I became fast friends. It stayed that way all through grade school. Since Blake was a bit of a joker, he spent a lot of time in trouble. I usually got drug into it by default. The teachers started to refer to us as the terrible twins. A few of them tried to separate us, and one even sent a letter home to my parents to say I was a good kid with a bad influence for a friend. The school would eventually get their way, but we couldn't be defeated. Between classes and at lunch, the two of us still got to hang out together and cause trouble. By the time high school came around, our days of troublemaking had long passed. We had discovered girls and spent less time together than we once had. On Friday nights, we'd meet up at the football game and catch up. I still viewed him like a brother, and we had loads of laughs anytime we ran into each other. Naturally, graduation came around and we were accepted to different colleges on opposite sides of the country. Once or twice a month during the semester, he and I would call and share any news in our lives. When we came home for holidays, we'd meet up at Denny's to talk treason, as Blake put it, or go to parties with other friends. It was at one such party where a terrible accident would change our friendship forever. My final year in school, I brought my soon-to-be wife home with me to celebrate Christmas. I was excited to be nearing the end of my schooling and hoping to introduce my fiancé to Blake. I had spoken to him the day before we arrived back home, and he mentioned a party was being held by one of our friends. We agreed to meet up there and talk treason over some beers. When that night came around, I tried to get my wife to come with me. She decided to stay with my parents so Blake and I could catch up without distraction. I left my folks' place at around 8:30 and showed up at the party soon after. I brought my case of beer to the kitchen and ran into Blake as he told some story about his disgusting roommate. After he finished his story, he and I went to look for a quiet place to chat. We chose the balcony. That Christmas was warmer than usual, so it was a great place to drink and smoke a little bud. We'd been outside a few hours and hadn't noticed how many others had joined us. When it got too loud, we decided to go back inside. I was the first to go in, and when I counted the number of people out in that balcony, I was shocked. It wasn't very big, but there had to be at least 25 folks out there with us. I had closed the sliding door behind me. Blake was still outside picking up the beer bottles. All of a sudden, the whole group, including him, dropped from sight. It was like the earth had swallowed them up. I was confused, unsure of what had just occurred, and when I ran to the door, I flung it open and looked down. What I saw was terrible, and to be honest, it still haunts me to this day. Below me, a mass of people, bloodied and broken, were writhing and moaning. Some laid silent and still. Panic washed over me, and I yelled down for Blake, to no response. Most of the other partygoers had now crowded behind me. They were unaware of what had happened until it was too late. Gasps and muffled screams roared out from all around me, and all I could think about was helping Blake. I pushed my way through the mob and ran downstairs. It was even worse than I'd seen from the apartment. Although one or two of the group were relatively unhurt, most were mangled. One uninjured guy helped me rummage through the pile of broken bodies. He was looking for his girlfriend, and we found her quickly. She was barely conscious and had others' blood all over her, but she looked to be okay otherwise. I helped him drag her away from the group, and I returned to find Blake. I flipped over 2 unconscious bodies and saw his bloodied face looking back at me. He was unconscious and didn't respond to my shaking. Soon, several others from the party arrived. 2 guys helped me lift and set Blake aside, and I was happy to feel his pulse, but I could tell he was in bad shape. He wasn't only at the very bottom of the pile, but he was among 5 others that landed on the sidewalk. I rode along to the hospital with the ambulance. The remainder of that night was filled with fear and grief, and witnessing people being told their friend or loved one had not made it all the worse. Just before dawn, I became one of them. Blake had just suffered too much, too many injuries to be saved. I knew it was a possibility, but I felt like the air had been knocked out of me, all the same. And at the end of that following week, the last person passed when his family made the harrowing choice to cease life support. All said, 6 lives were lost, and 18 others would have their lives altered in different ways. Those left behind were left wishing they could have done something more or different. Their numbers are countless, and I'm among them. 17 years have passed since that night, and it still seems like yesterday. From time to time, some of us to get together and discuss our feelings and at least attempt to help each other heal. I'm not sure if it does any good, but it gives me a chance to tell people about Blake. Wherever he is today, I'm sure he's causing all kinds of trouble. I hope I'll be allowed to join in the fun. I can't think of any better way to spend eternity than with my best friend. My cousin's 18th birthday wasn't just the day he became a man in society's eyes. It was also the day he learned a terrible lesson. Alex had been a handful from a young age. He was 7 the first time he had a run-in with the law. It was nothing major. I believe he stole a piece of candy on a dare or something like that. Regardless of its seriousness, that day would be the beginning of a troubled childhood. Fights would follow along with a break-in or two. His parents were clueless as to what caused it and especially how to stop it. My uncle tried talking calmly at first, but as time dragged on, he screamed more often than not. Things took on a whole new level when Alex began hanging with actual gang members. This decision confused many who knew him. He'd grown up in a good family, in a good neighborhood, with 2 loving parents. All things gang members don't usually have. When Alex started talking about joining the gang, his father took one final gamble. One night, an intervention of sorts took place. Every member of the family gathered together to save Alex's soul, so to speak. One by one, they poured their hearts out to him, doing their utmost to make him understand he was loved greatly by all of them. Somehow, some way, it appeared to work. They managed to get through to the stubborn and rebellious teenager. Even he broke down and cried along with them. Things looked like they were about to change for the better, and just in time. This meeting happened to take place a few weeks prior to Alex's 18th birthday. The family had planned a big to-do. It was to be topped by the unveiling of a special present for the honoree. The big day arrived and my aunt and uncle's house was crammed full of happy family. We began the festivities with a massive meal, followed by a cake made out of Alex's favorite ingredient, strawberries. As the time came to give him his present, a sense of excitement filled the air. His mother covered his eyes while his father retrieved his present. He was walking out and his eyes were uncovered. Alex almost jumped off the ground when he saw what stood before him. A brand new Ford F-150. His dream car. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He even asked his father for reassurance. When he dropped the key into his hand, he knew for sure that it was all real. I guess in order to savor the moment, Alex slowly walked toward the driveway where the truck was parked. His younger sister ran close behind him. Trisha may have been more excited than Alex himself. As he looked through the interior and sat in the luxurious leather seats, Trisha climbed around in the bed like it was a jungle gym. The family stood around oohing and awing at this beautiful truck, unaware of the car slowly driving by. A loud series of pops broke through the air, glass shattering and crumbling all around. The family searched for the source while confusion quickly took over. In the distance, an unidentified car screeched away. It all soon became so horribly clear. Alex laid slumped on the ground, blood pouring from multiple gunshot wounds. The body of the shiny new truck was riddled with holes and glass shards littered the ground. My aunt screamed when she noticed her son's bloodied body on the ground. Both parents rushed to his side. Amazingly, Alex was still conscious, but quickly going downhill. 911 was called within a minute, and the parents did all they could to keep their son alive. The rest of us could do nothing but stare blankly in shock. As the sirens cried in the distance, another far worse realization was made. Not until that very second had anyone noticed the absence of Trisha. My grandmother yelled out for her, and panic exploded once again. The air was filled with calls of her name. We all ran about frantically in search for her. A heart-stopping scream came from the area of the truck. I turned just in time to see my uncle lift her lifeless body from the bed. She showed no signs of life, and in that moment, we all knew the terrible truth. Nonetheless, her father fought against time, switching between compressions and breathing. All this did was increase the bleeding, and soon my uncle was saturated in her blood. The paramedics worked all the way to the hospital, but once they arrived at the ER, the doctors pronounced her dead. My aunt and uncle were beside themselves, catatonic, but truly had no time to grieve. Alex was still in grave danger. The police questioned all of us present, but as far as I know, no one knew anything about him. The family took turns standing vigil for the next 2 days. The doctors weren't able to give us a prognosis until the 3rd. Alex would go through 3 surgeries in those first 2 days. Finally, The morning of day 3, the doctors gave us good news. He would survive, but the road would be a long one. Later that day, when he regained consciousness, Alex was told the fate of his sister. I think the shock could be the best description of his reaction. No one other than the police could get a word out of him for some time. He was eager to help. Although he didn't see the faces of the shooters, he was almost positive of their identities. The death of a young girl in a drive-by naturally made the headlines, and the police were put under a lot of pressure to catch the perpetrators. The investigation did consume a large amount of time and resources, but eventually, the cops were able to get the driver to give up his partners. A trial was almost a year later in the making, and Alex was still using a cane when he testified. The verdict was almost a foregone conclusion by then. Both shooters are currently waiting on death row for their day with the needle. In our state, they have a better chance of dying from old age, but at least are off the streets permanently. Alex has healed for the most part, completely. The limp he walks with will always be there. Mentally, however, he'll never be the same. He blames himself for Trisha's death. He hadn't been completely honest with his parents about his relationship with the gang, and it turned out that he had been a member for some time, and the shooting was the punishment for walking away. He and I still speak from time to time, during the holidays and the like. One thing he said that will always stick with me was something about his father. Alex was around 15 or so at the time, and his dad was ranting at him about some trouble he'd gotten himself into. You may think you've gotten everything figured out, boy. So far, you've just gotten little slaps on the wrist. It won't always be that way. That's not the way life works. One day, your chickens are going to come to roost, and we'll all get what's coming to us eventually. You may end up in jail, or God forbid, dead, but it's your loved ones who will end up suffering the most. I could see those words still haunt him as they do me. For him, they must certainly be a fate worse than death. Since I was very young, the Christmas holidays have been my favorite. Even though I'm older and much wiser about how things work, I still find myself getting excited around this time of year. When I was only 9 years old, a terrifying incident involving a close family member almost destroyed my love for the holidays forever. I suppose I should give you all the relative facts that led up to it first. My family never ignored a chance to have a party. Whether it was a child's birthday or the 4th of July, we were all brought together to celebrate. I remember these parties were always well stocked with adult beverages, so to speak, but no one ever seemed to lose control. The worst that would happen was 1 or 2 people would get a little loud. A quick glance from my mother and they were rushed off to bed. Although the children weren't as involved in the festivities, we had fun nonetheless. A big spread would be laid out early in the day. My mom would make all of our favorite foods. This included every sweet and dessert that we weren't allowed to have any other time. After we ate, I'd join up with my cousins and play games in the park until the sun went down. Most of us would be wiped out by then and we'd be rushed off to bed. And this is when the adults really got to let their hair down. The incident I want to relate to all of you happened late one night after one of these parties had wrapped up. Earlier in the evening, I'd snuck out of bed to watch the grown-ups celebrate. It was Christmas Eve and all of us kids had been whisked off to bed early, as I told you, and I was curious, so I snuck out of my room. When I peeked around the corner, I got a full view of my parents and their friends sitting around our big table. They all had assorted drinks and bottles of beer in front of them. All I saw was a group of people having a calm discussion. I was about to head back to bed when my Uncle Johnny caught sight of me. Instead of getting mad, he smiled and wagged his finger at me in a joking manner. I laughed and ran off to bed, full of anticipation of the morning to come. I was eventually able to fall asleep. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I wake up and Johnny was standing next to my bed. I was confused, but when I saw it was him, I figured he was there to say goodnight. I remember how strongly he completely reeked of liquor. When he grabbed for the covers, I expected him to pull them out to my chin and maybe even give me a kiss goodnight. At that age, it was what grown-ups did at bedtime. especially as close as we were. Instead, he lifted them and told me to take off my nightgown. The request didn't make sense to me, and I asked him why. He quickly told me to be quiet so I wouldn't wake up the others. I continued asking him, but he repeated himself. The scary part started when he began pulling at his own pants. He was so intoxicated he was unable to stand upright and remove them at the same time. And somehow I immediately knew this wasn't right. I started getting scared. His next words will stick with me forever. "Come on, darling. Take off that nightgown so Uncle Johnny can snuggle up real close." I scooted away from him as far as I could until I was pressed hard against the wall. This entire time, he's still fighting with his pants. Out of nowhere, the door flew open and the hallway light flooded the room. I looked out and saw my grandpa standing in his pajamas. He screamed at Uncle Johnny. My uncle started giggling, saying he was just comforting the girl. She was having a nightmare, he says. Obviously, he had forgotten his belt was unbuckled. Grandpa just gazed at him with a sneer. Johnny began to laugh again, and Grandpa just charged at him. He grabbed Johnny's collar and drug him out of the room. The last thing I heard was Grandpa screaming expletives before the door slammed shut. I was frozen in bed listening to the struggle outside. At one point, a voice I think was Johnny's started actually begging for mercy. The rumble lasted no more than 20 seconds before I heard the front door slam shut. All the kids were waking up now and asking what was going on. A moment later, I heard a group of adults talking out in the hall. The bedroom door soon opened and my mom came in. She sat down in the corner of the bed. The other kids started whining and asking her questions, and she calmly told them to go back to sleep. They soon shut up and did what they were told. She turned to me and asked me if I was okay. I said yes. I was still confused and wanted to ask her what had just happened. I could see the fear in her face. She wanted to ask another question, but she was too scared. "I'm okay, Mama." I was eager to make her feel better, and when I said it, a look of relief washed over her face. She smiled, tucked me in, and left the room. I must have sat awake another few hours trying to calm down and piece together what I had just experienced. At some point, I fell asleep and didn't wake up until my cousins came and got me for my presents. I assumed the night before had been just some terrible dream. The adults were acting normal and nothing was said. My cousins and I tore through our gifts and spent most of the morning playing with them. After lunch, the rest of the family left for their homes and the three of us finally had the house to ourselves. That was when my folks came into the room and asked to talk to me. For the next hour, they asked everything about the night before. Once they were convinced I was okay, they explained things to me. Most of it didn't make sense at the time, but I listened intently. After that afternoon, it would never be spoken of until I was much, much older. My mom was dying from cancer at the time, and she wanted to be sure Johnny hadn't actually done anything to me, and I assured her Grandpa had stopped him before he could. I could tell she was relieved to hear this, and I was happy to do anything I could to make her passing quiet and peaceful. As you can imagine, Uncle Johnny was never allowed back around the family. From what I heard, he died a lonely drunk. Although I was somewhat saddened to hear of his passing, I was glad he'd been excised from the family. I can only imagine the fear I'd carry with me today having two girls of my own. I'd never be able to trust him again. You see, because when something so horrible is done, it can't be undone. Something so evil stays with you, and it stays with you forever. In my early 20s, I ran with a pretty rough crowd. I met several of the guys when I was working at a liquor store. We were all around the same exact age except for Calvin, who was just over 30. I guess you could say he was kind of our leader. Most of us had grown up without fathers, and Calvin seemed to fill that role. He'd been in the army when he was our age, seen the world, and had far more experiences in life. When I joined the group, Calvin had just recently been released from jail on drug charges. He wasn't a heavy hitter in that world, but he'd made enough waves to show up on the cops' radar. What we didn't know at the time was he'd shown up on another group's radar too. In our city, A small number of dealers controlled the trade. From what I've read, they were all supplied by the same people. Everyone had their own little corners, and peace was more or less maintained because of that arrangement. Calvin had begun to threaten that peace. Not only was it being supplied by another source, just his presence must have angered the wrong people. And on a dark, rainy night in 2011, those same people put an end to Calvin's budding enterprise, and I almost became collateral damage. Unlike most of my friends, I had a legit day job and no record. I had grown up in the same neighborhood, in the same way, but I had a stronger mother who did all she could to keep me out of trouble. I listened to her most of the time, but I was young and stupid. I wanted to hang out with the tough guys. Somehow, I managed to avoid trouble with the law. These days, I chalk it up to a combination of luck and common sense. Some unidentifiable force would tell me to leave. I learned to listen to it, and it kept me out of jail. I can't count the number of times it saved my neck at the last second. That rainy night in 2011 was one of them. Calvin and I crammed into his car with 3 other guys. One of the guys had been invited to a party. He said he knew which apartment it was in, but when we arrived at the complex, he was lost. This wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. He wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. We'd been driving around over half an hour. Everyone in the car was getting touchy. Suddenly, this guy points at the building and says he's positive that was the right one. Pretty general, I know. I was fed up with the games and decided to look for myself. I approached the building and didn't see or hear any signs of a party. I turned around and noticed another car parked alongside Calvin's. From my point of view, I couldn't see anyone inside. I took one step, but that unknown force told me to stop. Something about all of it made me nervous. So I stepped back behind the wall and watched, and I'm glad I did. No more than 5 seconds later, the driver of the other car opened up on Calvin. The shots lit up everything. I dropped down and cowered behind the wall. I was terrified they were coming after me next. The shooting seemed to last forever. Eventually, I heard the squeal of tires and a car speeding away, and I wasn't sure I was safe yet. I slowly crept to my feet and leaned toward the corner. It was now or never. I pushed one eye around the edge, half expecting to get a bullet in it. Nothing was there but Calvin's car. I listened for something, a moan, anything. But everyone was dead. Or so I thought. I carefully approached the car. The smell of gunpowder still filled the damp air. I went around to Calvin's door and opened it. I'm not sure what I expected to see, but it was horrifying. Calvin was riddled with holes and blood pooled in the seats beneath him. I fought all I could not to vomit. In the back seat, 2 of the 3 guys were slumped over the third. Sirens were now whining off in the distance. I was about to close the door when I heard a faint exhale from the back seat. It scared me at first, but I looked closer and realized Vaughn, the guy who dragged us out there in the first place, was still alive. I ran around to the opposite side and opened the door. Vaughn fell partially out. The police and ambulance arrived just as I was removing him. I left them treat him, and I had spoken to the cops. I think they were skeptical of my story at first. However, the longer they looked around, the more it made sense to them. The next few hours were even worse, if that's possible. I was forced to sit off to the side as the bodies of my 3 friends were bagged up and wheeled away. The officers were kind enough to give me a ride to the hospital. For the rest of the night, I waited with Vaughn's girlfriend for any news, and just before 5 a.m., this worn-out-looking doctor emerged to let us know that Vaughn would survive. Although he'd been struck twice in his liver, the surgeons were able to save him. He was questioned a few days later, but refused to identify the shooters. Vaughn wouldn't even tell me. Probably because he knew I'd go straight to the cops. And when it comes to my friends being killed, that whole no snitching stuff goes out the window. Naturally, no one was ever arrested. I did hear last year that one guy who was involved actually did take his own life, and the news made me feel a bit better, a little bit of closure for a while at least. And the murders would make me reassess my life. I slowly stepped from the rough set and found a new, less dangerous circle of friends. When my lease expired, I moved across town. This new neighborhood was a lot more neighbor and no more hood, so to speak. Although I do still speak to Vaughn and the other guys on occasion, that part of my life is behind me, and I hope to God, forever. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, and if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And be sure to try and catch a live stream on random Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.